Alarm Shark here. I kind of started this channel just to see how many people would respond to it. And apparently there's a lot of people out there putting in DMP, and lots of people are new at it. And I have made a couple of videos, basic programming and how to connect and doing all the basic stuff. But there are people that are having issues more depth into the programming. So this is going to be advanced programming. And one of the hardest things on an XR150 or a DMP panel in general is knowing where to put the zones. So in this video, I'm going to show you guys the different places to put zones, because that is one of the hardest things to learn on this panel. So we're going to go to Program, Zones. Now, DMP makes it where you can have zones on the LX bus or the keypad bus. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages to both. It really depends on the system that you're putting in. If you have access control modules can go on the LX bus or the keypad bus. Just so you know, the XR150, you only get 8 device addresses, and on the 550 you get 16. So depending on which panel you have might determine where you put the zone expanders. The advantages of putting them on the LX bus is you can address the zone expanders. Say you have an 8-zone expander, you address it to 00. That would mean your first zone would start at 500. So I get a lot of people thinking that they can just put the zone anywhere, kind of like a Honeywell panel, and just put the zone anywhere you want, and that's just not the case with DMP. And like I said, that's one of the hardest things to learn on this panel, is to where to put the zone. So if you are using the LX bus, the drawback to that is you cannot wire it to a keypad. So if you already have a keypad out in the field, you can't simply just wire off the zone expander onto that. You have to run a wire all the way back to the panel and wire it to the LX bus. But when it does come to zoning, it is definitely easier. So if you set the address to 00, your first zone expander would be 500, all the way up 501, 502, 503, 504, 505, all the way to the last zone. Say you had a 16 zone expander, you would get 16 zones, and they would all be in sequence. That's just not the case if you put it on the keypad bus. The keypad bus is where people get kind of confused. You have zone expanders that are on keypads. You have zone expanders by themselves. Say you have a 4-zone expander built onto the keypad. So if you do devices, you would go to Program, Device Setup. Let's expand this. Now keep in mind, the XR150 only has 8 device spots. If you have a 550, you get 16. So if you have a lot of access control, you may want to stick the zone expanders on the LX bus. If you don't have a lot of access control, you just got to keep in mind you only get 8 device spots on an XR150. Now on the zone expander itself, there's a dip switch that says LX or keypad bus. If you're using one or the other, you have to put that dip switch on which one you're going to be using, and it's going to have that dial. You always have to set the dial, depending on if it's on the keypad bus or the LX bus. You have to set the dial, and you have to set the dip switch. And that's Depends on where you put the zone. You can't just make it any zone you want like a Honeywell panel. Say you have a keypad out in the field and you have the keypad that has 4 zones on it. Instead of running a wire all the way back to the panel, you could just simply wire a door contact straight to the keypad. But of course, all keypads on the XR150s and the 550s, all keypads have to be addressed. So say this keypad is device number 1. We're going to add new. And we're going to make it device number 1. And we're going to name it, if it is a keypad, we're going to say lobby keypad. If you have multiple areas, you can tell this keypad what areas you want it to be able to see. We're just going to do area 1 for now. So if you do use the zones on keypad 1, your first zone would be 11. So the first number would be the device number, and you always do groups of 4 on the keypad bus. So if it's device 1, it would be 1 and then zones 1, 2, 3, or 4. So that would be 11, 12, 13, or 14. Now say the keypad device number is 2. Your first zone would be 21, 22, 23, 24. If it's 3, 31, 32, 33, 34. So that's how you would figure out where you would put the zone if it's on the keypad bus. Now say you don't have, say you're not wiring a zone expander to the keypad, or using the zones built onto the keypad. Say you're actually putting in an 8 zone expander on the keypad bus. So there's going to be a dial on the zone expander. Say you address it to 04. If it is an 8 zone expander, the first zone would be 41, 42, 43, and 44. Now, the second bank of zones, you have 8 zones on the expander, and if you addressed it to 4, the second bank of zones on the right, which you would think would be 6, 7, 8, and 9, that would be 51, 52, 53, and 54. But you have to set them up in devices. So say you did address the zone expander to 04, you would have to go in device programming and set device 4 and 5 to a zone expander. Device type, zone expander. Now, zones, when you go to zone information, once you created all your devices and created all your areas, the zone, it's going to let you program the zone anywhere you want, which is why people get in trouble, because they feel that they could make the zone and it just be anywhere they want. So when you do go to zones, you have to know which zone number to put it at. That's probably the hardest thing on this panel to learn. And like I said, it depends on if your zone expander is on a keypad, on a zone expander, or on the LX bus, because it can be anywhere. And you notice 51, that would be address 5, zone 1, 51. Now on an LX bus, like I said, 00, you can make that address 10. Then it would start at 510. And then your 8 zones above that. So you could have multiple zone expanders, one at 00, one at 20. Then that would be 520. But like I said, on the devices, you're limited to 8. So your final address would be 81 through 84. Now, as a rule of thumb, DMP kind of puts things in order, kind of like this, of order of importance. So when I'm first building a system, you probably want to start with devices. You just label all your devices, keypads, zone expanders, whatever access control modules. You want to put all those first. The next thing I like to do is areas. I kind of like to make all my areas. Of course, this panel can do areas, home and away. In commercial applications, I always use areas. I just feel it's easier, especially if you're doing access control. I'd always choose an area system, and that is under system options. Right here, you can switch it to area, all perimeter, home, sleeping away. I always, like I said, always in a commercial instance, I always use area. It's just, in my opinion, easier. I would always recommend programming all your devices first. Device 1, lobby keypad. Now, if you have a zone expander on the wiring with the keypads, we're going to do new. I always kind of like, if you are going to have zone expanders on the keypad bus, I always recommend, this is an XR150 panel, so we're going to start at the highest number and work our way down. And I always start with the keypads at the lowest number. So we're going to do this expander. Since it's an 8 zone, we're going to use 7 and 8. We're just going to call it warehouse expander. Here we would change it to a zone expander. Now, when I do this, we have to make device 8 also a zone expander, or else the second parts of the zones will not work. So we're going to make 7 and 8 a zone expander. The more detailed you are with the notes, it helps everyone in the future. And we're just going to change that to expander. Apply. So you notice we have lobby keypad. And keep in mind, I always start at 1 with keypads. And if you have an XR150, you would start at 8 and work your way down with zone expanders. Now, if you do have access control, I would probably recommend, depending on how many access control doors you have, because each access module is going to take up a spot on the devices. So if you only have a couple of doors and you want to run everything off the keypad bus, that's fine. But say you had 5 doors of access control, you would probably want to put the zone expanders on the LX bus. It really depends on the system. I mean, one system you may just have a bunch of zones. One other system you may have a bunch of access control doors. But it does give you that capability of putting it on either one. I mean, you can even put access modules on the LX bus. That's a different video. But the biggest part of this video is determining where to put the zone numbers, because I did have someone in the other video question, okay, I programmed a zone and it's showing faulted. It's more than likely because he just made up some zone number and thought he could just put it anywhere he wants, kind of like a Honeywell panel, and that's not the case with this. Now, lots of systems have, as you would call a partition on a Honeywell panel, they call it areas. This panel's kind of like an old Silent Night panel when it comes to areas. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with the Silent Night panel. I've done this for 25 years, so Silent Night panels were what we would put in back when I first started. They were extremely hard. One of the hardest panels you would ever think of programming. But DMP simplifies it, but they do kind of use the same scenarios, like having one wire go to a keypad or an access control module, and then all the wires wired to that, versus most access control panels where you would have to home run all the wiring. But with areas, you can make keypads display areas, whatever areas you want. You can put zones in areas. Just for example, we can make area 1 the store. We could make area 2 the cash office. Could make 3 the warehouse. Always hit apply. Now once we make the areas, then we would go to the zone. And like I said, you have to know, if you're just using zones 1 through 10 on the panel, it's no big deal. You know where to put those. But say you had it on the zone expander on the LX bus and you addressed it to 00, your first zone would be 500. Of course, we're going to go new, zone number 500. We're going to tell it what area it's on. We're going to do the store. We're just going to do front door. And apply. Now you can have zone expanders on the keypad bus and the LX bus. So say you're using, we're going to do new. Say you have a zone expander on the keypad bus or a zone expander on the keypad bus. You have to know what the address of the keypad or what the address of the zone expander is. Say we're putting it on keypad address number 5, it would be 51. And then you would assign it to which area. Say you have a keypad in the cash office and you want to assign it there. Cash office door. Apply. Of course, if you haven't programmed the devices yet, you would need device number 5. Set to cash office keypad. And here's where you would say, hey, I only want this keypad looking at the cash office. So we do display area 2. You would tell it what area this zone is, kind of like a partition. Say you had the cash office, well, you would want to set this cash office to cash office area 2 and apply. Now under devices, your cache office keypad, display area 2. So this keypad can display multiple areas, but we're just making it display area 2, so none of the warehouse zones or none of the store zones would show up on this keypad, kind of like a partition on a Honeywell panel. And once again, under devices, you may only want the cache office keypad to show the cache office zones, but the warehouse keypad, right here's display areas. You want to make this keypad show the zones on different areas. Once again, if you want it 1, 2, and 3, you would do 1-3. If you only want it on 1 and 2, it'd be 1-2, or 1-3 for 1 and 3. Now this comes in handy when you have multiple areas. Now if you have a wireless zone, I think that plugs into the X500 bus or the X bus on the panel. It has a specific spot that you wire the wireless receiver. The zones stay on the 500s. So wireless zones, I mean, you can basically put them anywhere you want so long as it's on the 500 range. So we would do zones. I never recommend, if you have a zone expander, don't ever cross, say you got a wireless zone 2, don't ever use, if you set the zone expander to 0, don't ever use any of the zones that zone expander could use in the future, or else you're just going to screw your service tech when he goes to add a zone in the future. He may not be able to use that zone expander zone. So here's wireless. We're going to do new. Let's say 520. We're just going to name it wireless door. We're going to assign it an area. Say this is the warehouse. Now you would go to wireless, check the box. Now we don't have a house code because this is a new install. Right here's where you would install the serial number to the wireless device. And that's that. The wireless can go anywhere on the 500 bus that you want. Now, if you have a wireless key fob, it would be under the 400 range, anywhere on the 400s. For some reason, they want the fobs on the 400s and the zones on the 500s. We're going to apply that, and you do have, in order to turn the wireless receiver on, you have to give it a wireless code. That number can be anything you want, but it cannot be 0. So we're going to add a 10 there. Once you add a number in the house code there, that will activate the wireless receiver that you install on the panel. One other thing to consider is profiles. I just had a customer the other day. He only had 2 keypads, but he needed 3 areas. One of the stores where they would have drivers come in the front door, and they didn't want them to have access to the rest of the store, only the front door. They could drop their stuff off and come in about 10 feet and walk out. So he needed 3 areas, but he only had 2 keypads. So you can make a keypad show multiple areas, but you could use the trucker's code. Only allows him to disarm certain areas. So you could have the front door on one area and have his code only activate that one area. So we would call this profile truck driver. Hit new. So this, we're just going to make it number 1, truck driver. Now see, here's where, okay, so if you have a zone just on the front door, and that's area 1, you would give him arm, disarm areas 1. If he needs access, if this particular one needs access to the whole store, you would do 1-3. That means he has access to areas 1, 2, and 3, or anything in between. If you only want to give him access to areas 1 and 3, it would be 1-3. So that's kind of like a DMP, because I mean, say say you need them to have access to 8 areas, you can do 1-8, and you don't have to punch in all the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. It's a little trick DMP gives you. Of course, a truck driver, you may want him to be able to arm and disarm, and I mean, you just have to go through all of the little choices that you can have that the truck driver may not be able to create codes or anything like that. You just check over what you want him to be able to do and then hit apply. And the final step would be user codes. We would add a new one. You can just make any code you want. Make any name you want. Right here's where you would tell it what privilege he has. So you set the privileges up under profiles, but this, I mean, you may have 10 of these. We only made 1, so we're going to assign him to the truck driver, which is 1. I hope this video helps you out in zoning panels. In my opinion, it's probably the hardest thing to learn on this panel. The second hardest thing to learn is probably how to program an access control door. Of course, each panel has hard parts and each panel has easy parts. This panel definitely blows a Honeywell out with alpha programming. You don't have to look up a book and figure out what words to, what numbers associated with what words. You can just use the alpha keypad with the numbers on the numbers. But on this particular panel, figuring out where to put the zone is probably the hardest part. If you don't really want to run an extra wire for the LX bus, you have the 8 zone or the 8 devices. Just make sure, I mean, you got to keep in mind, if you've got access control, each access control module takes up a device. But if you're only putting in 2 or 3 of them and you got a zone expander, you may want to stick with all keypad devices. It's totally unique to each system which one you use, but they are both there available. I hope this video helps you out, and that concludes the video. This is the Alarm Shark. Have a good night.